Jim will be speaking to us. He owns Schein and Schein Antique maps and prints and has spent most of his life in San Francisco. And he's an expert in local maps and is definitely not a stranger to many of the hidden stories and histories of the area. And you can go ahead and check out his map shop at right there. I'll also drop the link in the chat. It's going to be www.scheinandschein.com. And as of right now, the store is 100% accessible online, so you can go ahead and support him. And today, this is Jim's second program with us, and this time he will offer an extended exploration of Gold Mountain Big City, his new map book. And let's go ahead and welcome our speaker today, Jim Schein.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate that, Kimberly. It's nice to see you. It's great to be here with CHSA. This is my second discussion on the book, which delves into the Chinatown community through a map that was discovered through a process rather fortuitous and rather serendipitous, I think is the word we like to use. It's great to be here virtually or any other way, and I appreciate those of you who've come to attend. The presentation predominantly is about a book which was published this year, and the elaborations about that book and its inclusion and ultimate discussion around the Chinese American community in San Francisco and California. And I think it's a well-researched book. It was certainly a well-researched map. I was given a template. So since it is a book, I'm going to do a little screen sharing here. And I'm going to jump on PowerPoint, which is an easy way for me to do a slideshow and kind of show a little bit. The forward of the book is a simple introduction. My friend Gordon Chin, San Francisco native and Chinatown resident and neighbor, and publisher of a couple books of his own and some films on Chinatown Playground, was kind enough to do a forward when all this came to fruition. But that was at the end of a process that wound up being almost a decade. And in short, started in 2003 when we opened the map store. We had people coming to see us. And one was a woman by the name of Laura Dorenzo who brought us a proposal to come and look at her basement filled with maps. And this we did. And indeed, her basement was filled with maps. And we bought all the maps from her and we brought them back and we started to sort them. And we went through them and we discovered that there were a couple of things going on. There was the maps and creations of one individual, and then there was all this reference material. And the reference material was general and American and broad-based and celebratory and very interesting. And then about a year later, photographs from the same man came, and this man was a neighbor of Laura Dorenzo's who lived down the street. And upon his passing, his landlord said, Ken doesn't have any relatives or friends who want any of this. I'm cleaning out the apartment. Come down and take what you want. And Laura took pretty much everything that was of this man's artistic and creative life and put it in the basement of her rental unit at 1313 Montgomery. And there it sat for 25 years until we came to come and take it off her hands for a few grand. And so it was an interesting exchange, and she was a marvelous person. But about a year after that initial exchange, she came in with a photographic collection, which explained a great deal. And it was in fact the life's work of this man whose name was Ken Cathcart. And we established that this was a commercial work. I looked at it through a light box a little bit, and then I put it away for about 5 years. And starting about 2010, I started to have the photos scanned at a very high resolution, and that took a few years. And then once they were scanned, I put them on a website so that I could have them and share them virtually with the world. And they're available through our website to go and look at for anybody. Just log on to Schein and Schein and click the historical photo collection, and you'll have an opportunity to look at 3,500 photos of San Francisco and Seattle and other places. Chinatown has about 1,100 images. And so that process got me on a kind of rabbit chase, if you will, for many years. And once we had the Cathcart separated from the reference material, we sold off most of his reference material. It's inventory that we sold to make our store go on. And after which we had his works, I found that there were 7 maps which he'd created, and I had those hand watercolored by an expert here in San Francisco, a woman by the name of Ellen Cox. And after a few years, I decided to take one of those, the Chinatown map, which was the least familiar to me of the common stories being represented, and had it photoshopped and had it enhanced and did some extra work on it. And with that, we produced a lithographic copy of it in 2016. And that became the impetus to then say, okay, we've made this map. It's a pretty great map. It's a neat map. What's it mean? We really had less idea about what we were presenting than we really felt we should for something which we were presenting for sale in our store as a newly made product, a historic product of a map made in 1947. So that sent us down the process of researching it and writing about it, and then subsequently looking for publishers without much luck. Fortunately, we came across Lee Bruno and David Plant. Lee, another author of great accomplishment, several books, and David Plant, who's produced a private library of historic books of California history and has 25 or 30 books under his belt at this point. And Plant underwrote this book through a publisher, Cameron Press, owned by Abrams in New York City. And so through the grace of good fortune, that's how the book came about. 2019 was spent editing and rewriting a 450-page manuscript down to 160 pages. And that's what we get today. So with that, excuse me, with that, we have a new publication that, oh, great. There it goes. Mission control, bring it back. Sorry about that, folks. Gold Mountain, big city. And here's a copy of the book. And with that, see if we can get this baby to cooperate for me. You know, it's interesting. This was the cartouche of the map, which we took to use as the title for the book. Ken Cathcart's 1947 illustrated map of San Francisco's Chinatown. Forwarded done by Gordon Chin and done by myself. The characters, in fact, say Gold Mountain, Big Port. We had colloquially referred to it as Big City, and it was pointed out to me that, in fact, this is a colloquialism, and despite the commonality of it, in fact, says otherwise, and it's about landing here, and the first place that you land when you come to California. Our map maker, chapter 1 in the book, starts with an image of Cathcart in about 1942, presenting himself, a rarity for an artist or a photographer, but indeed a self-portrait, a selfie. With that came a lot of support. His creativity as a documentarian is shown here in the first day of ownership of a new Leica camera. Cathcart, a man at 35 years old, moved to San Francisco and moved to the 1200 block of Pine Street, and on his Christmas of 1937 received a Leica. And here we see the newspaper dated the day after Christmas as a compositional base for his Leica accessories. And in the middle of it, we see an aluminum film vial and the film related to it. And those are the exact film vials which were transferred and handed off to me by Laura Dorenzo some 75 years later as part of the collection. And they are the greater reason that we have an understanding of Cathcart's map of Chinatown or any of his works, because what the photo collection displayed was that this was a life's work of reference to provide iconographic support and reference information for stories, both as an author and as a map maker. This piece is on the same roll as this shot, so we know it's the same day, looking down California Street to the west, foggy or perhaps filthy day with cable car turning right on Hyde Street. Very early on, Cathcart got to work with his Leica camera, and early in 1938 established a relationship with B.S. Fong. And not only in the relationship to photograph his family, and here we see everyone, including his wife, who was the director of the Chinatown YMCA. B.S. himself was the representative of United and Delta Airlines in Chinatown, as well as a local merchant, and the interim president, that 10-year term, for the Chinese Six companies during these years. And he had hired Cathcart very early on, and probably his first gig was to come in and photograph and work in Chinatown to promote the China War Relief Association of America. It's 1938. The Second Sino-Japanese War is underway, where Japanese are in Manchuria, industrializing, and people are becoming refugees of this situation. And Chinatown has relationships here and is raising money through the six companies to support this refugee need. They're doing so through an organization that is meeting and making decisions as a group at large and putting their money behind the intent of their goals. Here we see an image by Cathcart in 38 with B.S. Fong in the middle at the end of the long table with many of the other officers of the six companies as well as their families in the image inside the meeting house at that time. It's a very telling story in regards to his role there as a commercial photographer and being invited into a community for a specific purpose. For the collection of donations, we see high school kids and the like walking through Chinatown, asking for money and setting up stations at local businesses with volunteerism to support the war relief. There are also a good number of events. Here we see the Chinatown YMCA band performing perhaps in the Mandarin Theater or perhaps at the Regency Theater over on Sutter Street. In the background, we see Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a philosopher and founder of the Chinese Republic. We see the political and economic support for what's going on in China at the time. But Cathcart is being given the privilege of life on the streets in Chinatown. He's a newcomer to San Francisco, a white man from the South, raised in the conservative South, here to perhaps reinvent himself. And it's an opportunity for him to photograph things that are around him. But with this year's explorations and the writing of the book, we find that it's likely that Cathcart came at it with the perspective of the influence of a book called Chinatown by Charles Dobie, published in 1935. And this is probably the first literary publication produced that was written with great success, of great high sales, to celebrate the Chinese American community as opposed to villainize it. And with it came an incredible amount of aesthetics and marvelous illustrations by Edward Sidham. And I think it was with this perspective that Cathcart is viewing Chinatown. The inclusion and the access to families and the merchants of local kids, the kids of local merchants, excuse me, young businessmen, the goods for sale within the community, the activities going on and the events that are transpiring. These are all part of his daily documentation. I think the greatest privilege of his access was an almost immediate understanding of the points of power and the points of importance within the community and the value of such men as Tsinghua Li and William Hui at the Chinese Digest, as well as his host, B.S. Fong, and the presidents of the six companies. Here we see the Chinese Digest office on 9 Cameron Place. It's a beautiful space, but important enough to have yielded an icon on the map later on, and the value of freedom of speech and the value of access to communication in this time. It also facilitated an introduction to Stidger and Stidger, fairly preeminent lawyers in immigration, and their location in Suite 240 of the Montgomery building, the Montgomery block as it was known, or Monkey Block, is really rather telling. They were the really preeminent immigration lawyers for Chinese American immigration, immigration issues, and exportation issues. In some cases, as early as 1906, we see the six companies hiring Stidger and Stidger in an effort to send some criminals back home, people they felt were not supporting the community. So it wasn't just for people coming in who required representation and weren't getting it, but exports as well. And Stidger were at the heart of this civil rights aspect. I think Cathcart had great privilege It also afforded him housing in the Montgomery block. So the site of Stidger and Stidger's office in Suite 240 also winds up being the site of Cathcart's home and studio for the next 20 years until 1958. Suite 428 in this building on the 4th floor on the backside would be his home, where these photographs would be developed in the dark room that we're looking at, and the map that we're discussing would have been drawn and sketched and created. So it's an interesting context to have this building. It's the site of the present day pyramid. It is at the edge of the financial district, the edge of Chinatown, the edge of the former Barbary Coast and the beginning of North Beach, and is a familiar sight to those who lived here prior to 1960. The map itself covers daily life for Cathcart around. Here within the map, we see 1853, the Montgomery block, built in 1853, was the first fireproof building. And then the predominant information within a block from that particular site is actually all of the places to eat for him in his literary world in Chinatown and North Beach at that time, excuse me. The Montgomery block is also the site of the bank exchange, which was here until 1919. And here we have a plaque from the E. Clampovitis organization of a benefactor, Humani Generis. A generous benefactor to the human race was Duncan Nickel, who invented and served Pisco Punch. Pisco Punch was a great San Francisco tradition from the pioneer days on. It was killed by Prohibition. Here we have the last day of closing night at the bank exchange when the 18th Amendment comes into effect in 1919. This actually had greater impact than just closing down this location. It shut down a neighborhood known as the Barbary Coast. And here we see another acknowledgement within Cathcart's map of his influences and some of the subject matter of the map. Cathcart's influence of Herbert Asbury's Barbary Coast. Asbury was a author who also wrote The Gangs of New York. We're familiar with him because The Gangs of New York was made into a film. Barbary Coast may one day as well. And it's a pretty good reading about the audacity and nature of this region of terrific street, Pacific Avenue in particular, and the early waterfront of San Francisco, an age of debauchery and danger. Cathcart, in fact, lives in this neighborhood at this time, and it's being illustrated in the lower half of our map. In fact, the majority of the content in this lower section is about the Barbary Coast and exclusively outside of the purview of the title of the map, Chinatown, but it is part of and its environs. And it's a well-researched part of the map which is included into the book. For Cathcart's time, this is what he's seeing. It's 1937 to 1942 in these photos, and we haven't built the international settlement yet. And this is the Montana. This is like 553 Pacific Ave, right next to the old Hippodrome in 1938. It's broken down. In fact, the neighborhood is derelict and abandoned. All of the old venues have been shut because there is no alcohol, there is no vice, there's no prostitution. And this neighborhood is an area used for everything from warehousing to just hiding stuff. Basically, we see buildings being torn down, and the stories of what was discovered in this building was rather interesting and written about a bit in the book. But this is terrific street, and at the time of Cathcart's investigation, it was a place in transition, and all of the viewpoint would be historic and nostalgic. It wouldn't be in the real time because it didn't exist in his time. And it merits pointing out because the remainder of the map is about Chinatown and the Chinese American community and its experiences in real time as well as historically. And therein lies the value in the map in its long term. But Cathcart also had the visual cue to go and explore where he was, and he was a photographer. And here we have a photograph of an area that's up on Telegraph Hill, and it's not part of the map, but I included it because it's coincidence that this photograph of his from about 1938 would wind up being, in fact, a photograph that includes his home from where he moved when the Montgomery block was torn down in 1959. He moved into number 23, Alta, right here. and this remained his home until his passing. And this is the place in which all of the material which I attained from Laura Dorenzo was stored until she took it and stored it in her basement up the street. In fact, up the street would be right here in this house. So here's where Ken lived, and this is where Laura lived. And this is a viewpoint that's actually taken by Carlton Watkins, and Edward Muybridge, two of the most important landscape photographers in the country for their time. Cathcart was aware that he was someplace that other people had already been and had already documented, and some of the heydays had already passed, but some of the great times were coming ahead. In that context, we get to the point of the maps. Cathcart would have known about this map, a pre-existing map, a map of the 1885 Chinatown. It's a map entitled The Official Map of Chinatown in San Francisco, prepared under the Board of Supervisors under the Special Committee of the Board of Supervisors, July 1885. It has a color code. For those who can't read it because it's very small or because it's in a script that's actually hard to read, it says general Chinese occupancy in tan, Chinese gambling houses in pink, Chinese prostitution in green, Chinese opium resorts in yellow, Chinese joss houses in red, and white prostitution in blue. Now, this map was produced by the Board of Supervisors of the City of San Francisco in 1885 as a map to define land use within a ghetto, a residence of required residency. And in fact, people have their doctoral thesis on this map because it is the first map, because of the technology of color printing and the segregationist laws of the time. We have a cross intersectionality where in fact, this is a map that nothing on the map is illegal, but everything on the map is immoral. And it is a map that has been used to reinforce a legislation that was created a few years earlier, simply called the Chinese Exclusion Act. It has a much longer title, but it was in fact a series and compounding of legislations which excluded the immigrant from China from attaining certain civil liberties and civil rights, not just as long as they lived here, but in their capacity to come and go and the capacity of land ownership. The Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect in its 100% fullest effect from 1882 till 1943. And Cathcart's map is part of a map as a part of a period, to celebrate post-war time at a time for the first time ever where the Chinese are not living under the entire authority of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's also a time where in our own hindsight, we see that that act really wasn't fully repealed until 1964 and the civil rights laws that were enacted at that time. But for Cathcart in his time in the moment, this is a most monumentous time. And it is the first opportunity to celebrate this monumentous time for him since the ending of the war. This map is known to many. It's a basis for all kinds of things, but essentially many of the things about it are surprising. And I mentioned the joss houses because I, as a young person, didn't understand the map was a moral map, and I didn't understand why a joss house, which is actually a temple, a family temple, would be on this map. But it was paganism, and that would be anti-Christian, and as such, this was part of the morality of the map, and not something that was illegal. And that kind of sent us down the path of what the origins of the map are. Because of that, then there's a lot of response to those maps. And at the end of the day, Chinatown creates its own map very quickly. Within 5 to 7 years thereafter, we see an identification of the land uses of Chinatown, the merchants, what they sell, their locations, their family affiliations. It's a very good map, and it sets a standard for then when J.P. Wong does a map, again, for promotion of Chinatown to Chinatown in this case. We have a map that is in fact entirely in Chinese characters and indicating land use by business owner in their name, indicating a organization has paid for the overall manufacture of this map for the promotion of Chinatown. And then within it, it has 2 insert maps. One is one of the Bay Area, showing that Chinatown is no longer restrained by the confines of the boundaries of the 1885 map, and that there's in fact a Chinatown in Oakland, there's a Chinatown in Marin, there's a China camp, and most importantly on that map is actually something very subtle. We see Angel Island having a connection to Chinatown. And this is the Ellis Island of the West. This is the Chinese immigration station. And if you were Chinese, you were kept on one side of the island. And if you were anything else, you were on the other side. And these this particular immigration station has got a lot of writings about it in the last generation or two that are fascinating. And the poetry carved in the walls there is pretty amazing. Excuse me. But it is also a point of reference for a community which denied representation by the Chinese Exclusion Act of the 1880s. That means that you don't count. That means you don't count. There is no number for you. It means you don't get to testify in a court of law. It means your testimony wouldn't count in a court of law. It means all of these things. But for the first time, there's a crack in that there is representation for those coming in, and there is a bulwark, a bulkhead, which is stopping and intersecting with all immigrants coming from China. And in many cases, people coming home are even detained for a period on this immigration station, despite being American citizens of Chinese ancestry. But at the end of the day, the fact that they are being counted, that they're being stopped, they can't be stopped and not be incorporated into the bureaucracy of the process. And as such, this is representation to some degree, and probably something that would have been actually of some celebration, or if not celebration, at least acknowledgement. There could have been great sadness because, of course, a family member could be on that island. And so there would be an emotional connection. The expansion of Chinatown from the 1880s is an interesting subtext of this map. Also, come 1939, in the time when Cathcart was actually working for the war relief effort, this map would have come out because the Golden Gate International Exposition, the GGIE, the fair out in the middle of the bay out on Treasure Island, would have been transpiring, and literally millions of Californians would have been coming to the state, from the state to the city and out to that island over the course of the year, and in fact, it turned into two, to come and celebrate this fair and San Francisco. And so here we see a 1939 Ethel Chung showing the highlights of Chinatown in a very simplified but animated form. And it goes to the heart of the conversation in regards to an animated or illustrated map. So here we have the illustrated map of Chinatown by Ethel Chung, and we see it's quite simple and iconographic and colorful and inviting and fun. And it makes Grant Avenue go right to the ferry building and to the exposition. It doesn't matter if it has any real accuracy, it's getting the point across very well. In fact, the fair map itself, this is the guide map for the fair that would have come in the guidebook, and it's a simplified version that, this is done by Ruth Taylor White, and she's an elaborate animated and cartoon map maker, and they asked her to tone it down with fewer characters. So we see a couple of sea monsters and a few whales and a few things, but much less than would be traditional for Ruth Taylor White. She's rather the archetype of animated maps for Western mapping. Cathcart adopts this, and after the war, we see him doing maps about California history and San Francisco's downtown. This is the map he did just before the Chinatown map, which was his fourth map, actually. My first, of his series, but his fourth in creation. And this, his third map, was a map about California, the gold region and the golden era. And I'm working on this map now for our second book. But Cathcart's fourth map indeed was Chinatown and its environs, a scrapbook map. Scrapbooking was the drawing of an image this big and ultimately blowing it down, reducing it, blowing it back up, cutting it out, overlaying it, photographing it, photolithographic overlays, and essentially scrapbooking, a creative process that was archaic, but it provided a great deal of detail to be able to be reduced, and was the process of the time. It's what he knew. And so it made sense that these maps were done so. Mine started as a sepia tone artist proof that had been hand watercolored, and it didn't look anything like this. But this is our map, and this is our end result, which Cathcart presented at the bequest of the 6 companies to promote Chinatown to European Americans and San Franciscans, outsiders, but also to celebrate Chinatown unto the Chinese community in a positive light, and was vetted in the time for its promotional value. It's a marvelous piece, and it's quite colorful. It's broken down in chapter 2, we begin with a typo. It should read 177 icons in 89 spaces. It says something other than that at the beginning of the chapter. And what it is that these icons are the little images, and each of these images is really telling a story. And it's telling a story, and I thought, well, I've got to figure out what that story is and what it's telling me. And that's really what the book wound up being about. The 89 spaces are subsequently an outer grid of A through Z, and an inner grid of A through G and 1 through 9 with intersectionality, an XY grid. It's a simple enough process, and it was really a very linear way for me to approach a very archaic and dense map that from the beginning was very difficult to take on and think about what it meant and how was I going to figure it out and look at them all. How am I going to do all of those? And with the help of staff and talented people like to research, and myself, who was the same boat, we managed to figure it out. And so with the outer border, we discovered that the A through Z of the outer border is in fact the story of Chinese American life in California. And it's told in a visual tale that's fairly simplified, and in many cases has some cryptic aspects to it that we explain in the book because they certainly caught my attention and were really one of the reasons we went with publishing the map and have been researching as much as we have, because there are so many questions for us. Right off the bat, the upper right and upper left-hand corners of the map show the Chinese Republic with a revolution date of October 10th, 1911. And on the upper right, we have the Manchu Empire, also known as the Qin Empire, Qin Dynasty, running from 1644 to 1912. We notice that these dates don't necessarily coalesce, that one is the incoming government and the other is the outgoing dynasty. And of course, those dates are correct. Cathcart did his homework, and these were the official times of things transpiring. As a result, we have grown up with 10/10 parades in Chinatown. Here's a 1938 October day, and we see Chiang Kai-shek on a banner running across Grant Avenue. At this time, this would have been 1938, 39, so he probably was president of the Republic of China for 10 years, 8 years at this time. 10/10 parades would have transpired well into the 80s, and perhaps they do today, actually. Probably not quite as big or quite with the understanding of what it was about. And it was the transition of the Qin dynasty to the age of a democratic Republic of China. Many of the people living in Chinatown came from the same place as Dr. Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, and these common histories and common fights were well recognized and becoming evident in the documentation here in the map. In B&H, we represent the Chinese labor for railway, which is a story we know, and engaged with the 6 companies and Central Pacific Railway, among others, and all the spur lines going on well into the 1870s. But Cathcart's inclusion in the lure of gold might appear simple to some, but since just the year before he had done that California gold map, Cathcart had a good understanding of the breadth in which where the Chinese community went in California, and places as far up as Oroville and Yuba City and Marysville, the third city or third port known to some. So his understanding of the Chinese American community in Sacramento and its importance recognized on, these are icons from that map, as well as the actual existence of Chinese camp. And the Chinese camp, also known as Chinese or Chinese, we see it in documentation in the 1850s. It actually is a bar that didn't peter out until the 1880s, 1890s. It's a very rich area, but it also shows the Stone Fort Tong Wars of 1856, really the first known Tong War in the United States between the Sam Yap and the Yan Wu. And this is an interesting point because to get to the level of understanding, to include that into a map about the state at large and the gold history, gave Cathcart, I think, an insight into the value of and importance to him of its inclusion of an icon on the map. C, D, F, and G are representative of the trades and skills allowable to those of Chinese ancestry under the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so as such, these are the jobs you may do, and any contingent to these jobs in support of it might be possible. But at the end of the day, this is it. And of course, the first is merchant. I have, for this display, gone through the photo collection and through Cathcart's own reference library of material to get new data for the visuals. We've done this for the Chinese Historical Society of America before, and they've recorded it quite graciously, and I thought visually it would be nice to have some different references. I did not include any of the traditional postcards that preeminated or came out of Chinatown from 1895 to 1920. And this is one of them, and we'll see more of them in here as they represent some of the pre-existing representations that Cathcart would have been familiar with much more closely than we would in the time and in the moment. Here we see a traditional representation of the photograph of a Grant Avenue retail store, and we see rather modern gentlemen at the end and their staff all here. And this happens to be Bing Tong, who's high member, perhaps at this time president of the 6 companies, and his retail store on Grant Avenue. This was graciously provided to me by his family, and is a marvelous insight into the beauty of a Grant Avenue storefront and the simplicity in the presentation of retail goods. We see glass fronts, haberdasheries on the right, all kinds of canned goods on the left. But a marvelous period of updating. Of course, by Cathcart's time, that would have changed as well. And we would have had a great number of women represented in the ownership of these businesses on Grant Avenue, and a lot of representation that would not have existed in just a generation before. We also have laborers represented in D, and here we see a restaurant gentleman with a nice smile for Cathcart. Owner, perhaps an owner of a retail, perhaps a merchant, but a laborer shutting down at the end of the day. Here's some 70 to 100-pound boxes and baskets to move around. Laundry and laundry labor, of course, would have been available as work. And then fishing. Here's the owner of the California Shrimp Company, 1937-38. This would have been removed for the war, with all the waterfront going to industrial and military needs for the next 7 to 10 years. Farmers would have been also an option for a person of Chinese ancestry and living in the Delta. We see towns like Locke and Walnut Grove that still house large communities of descendants of the people photographed here. Maybe not that kid, but that's a marvelous shot. And then, of course, teacher and scholar. This was important and goes to the heart of the Chinese American community's goal always, and the importance of education, and that with an education, one can become more than the limitations of the cultural imposition and succeed at all of those as well. Here are some of Cathcart's reference images from around the neighborhood, local Freemasons. All of the icons on the outer border, in fact, emulate photos by Cathcart and his daily documentation. And so they helped me to really understand what they were. But then with further research into both his archive and just in general looking at the markets, we see that there are some traditional presentations. There's some pre-existing protocols. So with the photograph of the dragon being unboxed, we of course have photographs of the dragon parade in Chinatown and the feeding of the dragon. These are things that would have been readily available in the market. And so when it became available to photograph one, of course, he did so. And this is a marvelous comparison for me as an outsider, as someone who actually has only seen dozen lion dragon dances and parades, because it's generally raining. And walking down the hill from North Beach had to walk back up. Seriously, it was something that I only saw a few times, and I've actually have to admit that over the course of the book, we'll see some confusion as far as whether we're looking at dragons or lions, and that's why I'm being so sarcastic. Is in fact, I really have been challenged, and I think my editor was as well. But we've done our best, and with that, we've been getting a lot of forgiveness and generosity from the community, and some pointers as well. So anyway. Cathcart, his illustration of the telephone building is so much like the postcard of the period. And it's of course important, it's even on Ethel Chung's map from 1939. It's a building that was destroyed in 1906 in the earthquake and fire, but, excuse me. But it wasn't fully destroyed in the earthquake and fire. In fact, a great deal of it was salvaged prior to the fire reaching there and taken out of the building. And we see that. Here's a pre-fire photograph, and it's 4 gentlemen all attending the board. And after the earthquake and fire, they replaced them all with women. And I'm not sure what came about of that and why, but all the men and women who worked here had incredible spatial memory, and that they had to understand all of the incoming calls, where they were coming from and the language in which they were speaking, which was generally English, but not always, and know where to patch through to when being asked for a person, and understand who that person was, what the relationship was to the community, where they lived, what their address was, where their cousins lived, and also what community they came from, before they patched them through in that millisecond of thought. An incredible amount of knowledge and spatial knowledge that went on inside this building. And it was an essentiality when all phone calls had to come into a relay station and then be patched through to their destination. With rotodialing and autodialing in 1949 or 50, this building became obsolete. But due to the Chinese Exclusion Act, this building was a necessity. And when telephone came in the 1880s, it was a great point of pride in the 1890s to have had this building to facilitate the most technologically advanced communications in the world and access Chinatown, and Chinatown being able to access the outside world. Because of the Exclusion Act and the nature of this technology, it was segregated, and that is why it had its own exchange. It's an odd set of circumstances that created it, and technology ultimately discreated it. Geez, I'm having a hard time with real words today. Basically, it destroyed it, and it became a bank and a nostalgic representation of itself. But its story was of great importance at the time of previous generations in the community that was here, and what it represented. It represented independence, it represented the capacity to communicate, it represented freedom of speech, and of course these were very important things. Cathcart's inclusion of traditional dress characters was very interesting, because by his time it had predominantly disappeared, but we find that it was something of not such a great time passing, that it was in recent times that it had disappeared. I've been graciously given this family photograph, again, of Bing Tong and his family, who at this time is about 1908, and he's on his way to China with his 7 children and wife. The photograph is flanked by, on the left by Jenny Tong, and on the right by Lily. They go to China and return to San Francisco's Chinatown, and 10 or so years later, they have another family photo taken, and it's rather telling in the modernity and the change of times, and the roles of the men and women in the community at large. And it is a time of modernization. When they went to China, it was the Qin dynasty, and at the time of this photo, we're now in the modern age of a Chinese republic. And this is a both political impact, as well as at the time there's a great effort of the aspect and the concerns or the interests of assimilation, and the idea of adopting Western dress and understanding Western culture a little more. And so that's quite well represented. As we move around a bit, we have a little flat iron there, just a little flat iron. It doesn't say much, but it actually speaks volumes. The charcoal flat iron is about the idea of a pressed shirt. And the fact is, in the pioneer ages, you didn't get a pressed shirt. The idea of a clean shirt was a novelty. Chinese laundries were celebrated and revered for their efficiency and cleanliness, and the idea of a starched shirt with a flat iron collar was incredible. And many a family business, both here and in LA and in Chicago, all revolved around family laundry. And this business starting back as early as the pioneer times for us, the 1840s. Here we see family laundry on the corner of Waverly Place. But we also see something that's interesting about the laundry that I would like to point out, which here it is. It's a time of exclusion and segregation. It's a time when technically as a Chinese American or Chinese immigrant, you don't have representation legally, yet you have a union. Here's a Chinese ladies garment local union local 341 for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive, until I looked and I found that there was actually competition, and you could have gone to the AFLs before they were AFL-C of O, and to the laundry workers local 26, and this was the Oriental branches. So there was unionization in Chinatown, and this was a certain amount of protections and assurances of work. And it could have also been a certain type of exploitation, in that if you didn't join the union, you weren't going to get this work or that work. Everything has a two-edged sword, but nonetheless, this was representation, and I think it was important, and I think Cathcart recognized that in his documentation and photographs. T and P are really both about the culture of fresh food in Chinatown, and they're really just shots of everyday life around the boundary. And in fact, so many of the images, as we say, emulate his photographs, and his photographs are of walking around Chinatown. So of course, he's going to see everything that we see in these images. But he's also, again, if we look at this image and we look at the following image from 1883, they're almost the exact same representation, which is rather interesting in its stereotype, but also its simplification of a conversation. This is drawn from a photograph in 1883 and also will be rendered from real life. We see the Chinese New Year and the Lion Dance and the firecrackers and the incitements as an important part of Chinatown. And of course, he's photographing that here. We see an opening of a business on Stockton. And of course, the firecrackers are an all-important part of Chinatown historically. We don't see it or hear it quite as much, but we still hear rounds of 100,000 or 200,000 every couple of days, you know, and you can hear that all the way up to the top of Telegraph Hill, you know. It echoes rather substantially, but this was a daily and continuous occurrence at this time in this generation. That's quite an explosion. Cathcart's included the old joss houses, formerly reviled on our 1885 map of Chinatown as sites of idol worship and paganism. In fact, documented well as ornate centers of family assemblance and prayer. And these are included both by the temple as well as the building itself. Now, the old temple on Waverly Place also actually exists. It still exists today, still available to go for visitors. But it's also here on the left-hand side of this 1892 pamphlet promoting San Francisco and Chinatown, pre-earthquake and fire, shows the same building in the same site. Of course, it's burned and reconstructed, but nonetheless, he's again following established protocols, but doing so with a form of modernization. This would have been his set type protocol for children. This is a postcard from 1905, and it's important to acknowledge, though, that it was Arnold Gente who in 1908 published a book of photographs, and this book of photographs was the first book of photographs of the Chinese American community, with or without their approval, that celebrated the humanism of the community and the tradition and the life within Chinatown. And after two generations solid, if not three, of villainization and segregation and exclusion, this was the first real published attempt. So we have Cathcart's map paying homage to Gente. We have him paying homage to Dobie. as the softeners of the rhetoric, the anti-Chinese rhetoric of the Kearnians, 1870s through the 1890s, and Dennis Kearney, ultimately stemming greatly from Irish labor and the desire for cheaper labor and the competition between these Irish immigrants and the Chinese for the cheapest labor spot. And San Francisco became a Kearnyist town. But all of that greatly influenced policy for a great number of years. And Cathcart's at the waning years of those to some degree, and that he's actually had some model and some role types to be able to emulate and to be able to present. And in our view now, it might still be patronizing, but it's, I believe, both vetted and not intended as such, and an acknowledgement and a reminder of an existing good that should and merits celebration and acknowledgement. So it's very subtle, but we see the nuance in that. And we see that in his photography of all of the local kids working in the neighborhood, and their ability to interact in a really human way. And of course, in Z and the final icon for the outer boundary, we have the Chinese 6 companies, his hosts, and people who ultimately have provided him a rare opportunity to photograph and engage and support the goals of a community. And doing so, he acknowledges it through his photographic record and the places we see the China War Relief banner on the front of the building. Still the 6 companies building on Stockton Street, still there with the school next door at 841, still there. This is a 1919, so this would be 101 years that we can look at this and say there's some stability for the community, and Cathcart is presenting that and the value of that, and I think he does so well. And that takes us through the outer boundary and brings you to chapter 3 on the book. I hope I haven't lost too many of you. It's pretty fun stuff, and I tend to get a little distracted by my own desire to tell too much detail, and ultimately there's only so much time, and I want to make sure that I don't neglect anything of importance. I still am doing good though. So with chapter 3, we have the inner grid. It's 150 some icons of Chinatown and the Barbary Coast, stories old and new. And it's entailed, and it's got a lot of stuff going on, and it was overwhelming. And a lot of his maps have a lot of stuff, but nothing quite like this. And it's a breadth of culture and the color and everything. And fortunately, it's overlaid with a city grid. And that city grid is just perfect for laying out a grid as far as figuring it out. And so the book goes and it establishes that grid, and it articulates the icons in relationship to what block they are sitting on. The book itself discusses Chinatown, its environs, a scrapbook map. Cathcart is reinforcing the fact that scrapbooking is part of his thing. And that's rather interesting because it shows he spent so much time on it, but I don't know if anybody really cared that these things were cutouts and laid out and made this way. I just think that that's just the process of what it was. And in doing so, though, he's allowed me to create PDFs and small little articulations about each of his little images. In the 4 corners of the inner grid, we have gaming in Chinatown. And gaming in Chinatown still is a big deal and still transpires. Something we hear every day. As we walk through the alleys, we hear games being played. The chess is a long-standing history of the Chinese, and perhaps the Tibetans, Chinese, Indians, Nepalese inventing chess. Either way, it's going back a couple of millennia, and a game that's associated strongly with the Chinese. Fan-tan and Mahjong are, in fact, games played still today regularly. They're somewhat regional. Mahjong, the pieces are identified by names or characters, but those names and characters change often subtly depending on what community you're from within China, and the character represented with it can be different and what it is. And so often we see these games being played as part of a community effort of people who are expats, and this is how you get together with people. And we see that all over the place. We see Giordano brothers all the Pittsburgh Pennsylvanians go for their sandwich, and the Irish pubs, and et cetera, et cetera. And this was a way of really getting regional and local contact with people who spoke the exact same dialect as you, even if you didn't know them there. And then, of course, the Chinese lottery. Chinese lottery is really one of the few numbers that wasn't entirely squashed by government. It was probably grafted by the police, but in fact, Chinese lottery paid out, and at a time when gambling was illegal, all gambling was illegal, and the only people who got away with it were churches doing bingo and giving away cheap prizes. Chinese lottery actually gave real money, and people won significant amounts of cash with the lottery. So gaming is an important part of the community. We also see his bold icons, and each icon, of course, I realize as soon as we start really delving into the photographic record that we're going to have an example. I just have to look for it. And this was the one that I'd been looking for a long time. There are a lot of photos, but this is a kite festival down at the Marina Green, or actually Marina Middle School. And this is our prototype kite for that. And this roll had marvelous continuity shots and all kinds of kites and all kinds of activities, but this was our model type. And of course, here's probably, if it wasn't homemade, is where it would have been bought, a big part of Chinatown culture and a big part of having fun for being a kid, all the way up into the 80s. I remember buying kites in Chinatown with my parents in the 60s and 70s, but certainly I remember seeing a lot of kites down on the Marina Green coming from here well into the 80s. And this family moved to the wharf and moved their business there until it closed. Right away, we also see a lot of figures who are identified, who are absolutely unfamiliar to the novice. Dr. Ing-Pun Chu is singularly most important newspaperman of Chinese ancestry in the United States. Since a gentleman who started as a minister and ultimately was given a parish, and then started a paper in Los Angeles, and I think it caused him to really want to be more of a newspaperman, and he moved that newspaper to San Francisco in 1900 and called the Chun Sa Yat Po. And this was the first Chinese published newspaper, that is to say, in the Chinese language in the United States. And it's important because he was an incredible advocate for the philosophies of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the idea of Chinese Democratic Republic, and fought vehemently for the support politically from the Americans for that goal. He also was a vocal critic and outspoken, articulate critic of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the laws predicating it, and used Chung Sa-Yat Po as his platform, and attained a good deal of attention, and singularly is the strongest force for the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act as a constant emissary and conversationalist on the subject matter his entire career. And so here he is represented in the middle of the map, and I found it telling and also very poignant, and also for me educational, because before the map I didn't know who he was, and there was a great deal about him, and it's an interesting story. I'm going to guess that people could have their doctoral thesis on this guy. And so with that, it goes to the heart of one of the things that Cathcart's trying to do. He's trying to take a big picture and sum it up in an icon. This is 101, but you could probably take 3 years or 4 years of courses on this guy and what he did and what it precipitated politically. But for Chinatown in San Francisco, it precipitated support for the ideals of democracy. And with that came the ideals and the philosophy of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who in fact had spent time living here in Chinatown, 1909, or excuse me, 1903, and ultimately had a relationship with San Francisco, and has now a statue in St. Mary's Park created by Benny Buffano. So here on the map, we see these, and in fact, is Cathcart's photographic record, the marvelous photos, St. Mary's in the background, and a a few arty shots. And of course, these were taken the same day that he was there with Benny himself. So there's a connection between Cathcart and Buffano and Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and of course, this statue. It is believed that Dr. Sun Yat-sen wrote and constructed the Constitution for the Republic of China in the Montgomery block at the offices of Stidger and Stidger, while under the protection of the Freemasons while living in San Francisco. This is ultimately the backstory on that. And with that, Cathcart would have been aware of that, living in the Montgomery block and having that relationship. The Montgomery block also facilitates a relationship with him understanding who Don Kingman is, an important Chinese American artist born here and traveling through here, LA and New York, doing watercolors of great celebration and a great promoter and a very gregarious painter of great talent. We've got a nice image of him from a magazine called Pay Dirt, a 1949 celebration of California history, putting Chinese American community in the middle of that and celebrating his creative talents. But for Cathcart, he puts him in the middle of the map because he's a neighbor. Ken also includes the historic contributors to the Chinese American community. The 49ers we mentioned earlier, in a traditional sense, walking their way up to the gold field. First city, second city, third city. And ultimately, simple reminders that reinforce the origins of the community. The merchants of the 1850s being the first Chinese Americans to arrive here with some wealth and trade skills and possibly some imported goods and the capacity to generate more wealth and create a merchant community. And San Francisco's Chinatown, people predominantly from Canton as it was known colonially, Guangdong, and in many cases the Toisin section of Guangdong in particular, this was a point of pride and a point of wealth, and part of the success of San Francisco's Chinatown is the merchants community and the wealth, work, and direction and common goals created through those families. We also see certain homage to some of the darker sides of the community. We also see the connection again with the influence from Cathcart's love of Dobie's book, Chinatown from 1935, because when we see the slave girl, it didn't take me too long to see that his reference was directly to Edward Sidham's sketch from that very book. So the correlations are pretty strong. He's making use of very solid and well-received references from about a dozen years earlier to reinforce the iconographs that he's creating for the modern time. And indeed, it is a modern time. He's walking around and looking at the community that he's part of now. And by the time this map is made, he's been photographing for about 10 years and working and creating a reference file. And here we have a modern slit skirt in application, a merchant walking down Waverly Place with the Chan building in the background. In fact, an important and well-known spot. Cathcart's also acknowledging, again, within the map, the fresh foods and accessibility of food and cooked food within Chinatown. This is not just important to him because he doesn't have a kitchen and lives in the Montgomery block. I think that's probably a good part of it. But I think it's also about the contribution of this accessibility to food and the importance of food within the culture and the value of that. The inclusion of Tray Man puts me down that path a little bit and started me asking, well, what is that? And what superficially, what can we attain or what can we apply or attach to that? And when we see Tray Man, it's a name I've never seen or applied to anybody, a delivery guy. And it's obviously his own creation. But there were two dozen photographs of men carrying dim sum and tea around the neighborhood, this guy included. And the phenomenon went to the heart of, well, where are they going? One would ask. And it's about the work ethic of the Chinese community, and that great number of people are working hard enough or too hard in our hindsight sometimes. Hard enough that they don't have the time to take off of work. They are working a 12 to 18-hour day, and ultimately they need nourishment, but they can't stop. The job doesn't pay them to stop, or safety doesn't allow it, or whatever. And in comes lunch. And this is not just one or two people. This is incredibly common. This is prolific. And the idea of food delivery is in fact novel. And I've said it before, and I'll reinforce it. My belief is that prior to 1960, when we started getting Little Caesars or Domino's pizzas delivered, food delivery did not exist outside of Chinatowns in this country. So in New York and San Francisco, and Chicago and Phoenix, we might have had some food delivery as a result from the Chinatowns within there. But in fact, you never got food delivered. It was novel, but you also, the idea of just prepared foods being brought home was absolutely foreign, no pun intended. It really was unfamiliar to European culture. And of course, in the 1800s, we see this documented in great celebration because the Europeans have horrible nutrition and horrible teeth and horrible dietary functions. They're eating crap, and basically they don't eat well, and it shows. And this is something that is really celebrated and embraced by Cathcart. And I dwell on it a bit because there was no delivery of food outside of Chinatown until the 1960s. And in a time when we live by delivery in order to get our meals more and more frequently, I find that fascinating. It's a huge contribution to the American picture, the greater immigration picture, and where we get our influences and things that are yielded here that don't exist elsewhere and why they don't. So here's another tray man going down Sacramento Street, and coming right across Waverly Place, of course. Waverly Place being the site of the family associations, and where a lot of the benevolence needs to come for him to have made a map like this. The 6 companies being hosts is great, but he needs the support of the community at large. And this represents at that time those families and their places of worship or places of assembly. And of course, there would have been a family business on the ground floor, as well as an office on the upper floors. This is the same, this is Waverly Place. Very similar shot to the woman in the slit skirt. We see the Chan family building down at the end. This would be before the earthquake and fire. And then here's Cathcart with his another rendering after the earthquake and fire. Very easily recognizable. I use the Chan building as a reference because if we go and look at it today, it's similar, but if we look at the top, it doesn't say 1910 on its building date. It says 1964 because it was rebuilt. So it's something that is very subtle in the scale, but it's a larger building. And Chinatown has changed in very nuanced ways. But aside from that, these brick buildings, the majority of them and their iron railings remain today. As do such institutions within the community, such as schools like the Namku. This is a regional school. That is to say, if you came from a specific region of China, then your education was provided for free. If you came from another region of China, it was provided at a reasonable cost. And it was a Chinese immersion school, and many kids went there. And it's a school that still also existed for my generation. But it's also a school that had a postcard made for it. And I find that interesting because the iron fence in the front in 1940 is the same one represented in the postcard from 1908. So certain continuities, again, existing protocols, but things to be celebrated, and the importance of education, the importance of scholarship, the importance of stewardship. These are the points of his inclusion and the value of them. They also are the milestones for my generation and older of life's experiences and where we spent our time and where we went and came and went and the people we went with. But in general, their representation of the community at large are the anchors. This is a marvelous shot of Commodore Stockton, and of course included on the map next to the Chinese hospital. And a Chinese hospital being pivotal in regards to the independence of the Chinese American community in Chinatown in San Francisco. This was funded and constructed solely on funds and donations from the community within Chinatown. It was built, I believe, in 1924 is what his icon said, and it remained until just a few years ago when it was deconstructed and removed for a larger, more facilitated, more modern, bigger hospital that provides the same services for a larger Chinatown community. Many people have come to me since I've been speaking about the book and have told me about how many of them have been born in this hospital. If you grew up in Chinatown, you were born in this hospital, in most cases for my generation. And ultimately, this is the only place that as a Chinese American, you could be assured of service. And when you got out of California, you can imagine it would have potentially even been worse. The fact is that this was a long-standing tradition. If we look at an 1859 map, this is a manuscript map of the lands west of Van Ness, known as the Lagoon Survey. And we're way out at Octavia and Lombard. And out there, we see the Chinese hospital. That's indicated right next to the big Gough Street Lagoon. And so this Chinese hospital, again, at its time, 1859, was way out of town on the other side of the hill. But it was the best and the closest the Chinese community could get and have self-containment to attain the medical attention that was required and often differentiated from the treatment they might get from a European doctor. So it was important and it represented the independence of the community. We see within this map some very telling and important aspects. The well-known Chinese laundry would sit at the edge of the water between the Chinese hospital and the lagoon itself. And on the opposite side of the lagoon is the Lagoon Survey. These were lands that were given away to people of merit who had represented the Americans in the fight against Mexico to attain California. So essentially, many of these men were pioneers, and they were pretty much self-contained and celebrating anybody who could make it and make it out here was all right by them. And this was the, the equivalent. Some of them had religious undertones to that belief, but at the end of the day, you had a fairly egalitarian group so far in regards to our research and what we found out about them. Just beyond the reaches of their lots is technically the end of San Francisco. And the Chinese hospital is 100 feet beyond that. And it's outside of what was the city charter line of 1850. So these are the kind of things that kind of go to the heart of why a community might build its own hospital within Chinatown to service its own needs, and still has done so. We also see the celebration of temples and churches in the community, and Cathcart has a lot of fun with this in his access and gets a good number of photographs which are there. I've elected to pull out some of the classic postcards that were from prior to the earthquake and fire. But we also have a Cathcart photograph from the Rust Building. The Rust Building is still there. Until 1964, it was the tallest building in the Western US, so west of the Mississippi. And as such, it had a viewing platform, like maybe on the 2 floors down from the top. And Cathcart made a habit of going up there, and we probably have 40 rolls of film that are just taken from there. And they do a pretty good job of photographing Chinatown from the air as well as the rest of the city. And on this shot, in the foreground, we actually see the Kong Chau Temple, and its access point was off of Pine Street. Its address was like 512 Pine. And you walk down an alcove to this building that was on a flagstone lot in the middle of the block. This is St. Mary's before we put a parking garage underneath it. And then in the background, we have St. Mary's Hospital with Sing Chong and Sing Fat on the corners. This is a marvelous photograph of Chinatown circa 1939 or so. And the Kong Chau Temple was torn down around 1950 for a new one put on Stockton, and the Bank of Hong Kong was put on the corner there. Here's a nice shot. Cathcart does a few of these artsy shots, which are pretty fun. And they were fun to find in the collection because as a negative, I couldn't tell what this was. But you see this sign, "Son, observe the time and fly thee from evil." Still there every day when we walk past it, it's still there. Cathcart celebrates Hang Far Low quite a bit, and among others, and I'm not quite sure he specifically celebrates them, although I think they were generous and perhaps benefactors. There's a few rolls of film of him doing things there. And of course, the importance of social gatherings and the importance of going out to eat and the importance of that dynamic is not wasted on him. Here we see his host, B.S. Fong, at a luncheon with a couple of European gentlemen, as well as other members of the Chinese American community, discussing something. And I'm going to imagine that the empty seat at the table is in fact the one for Ken. So it's an interesting and telling photograph at the second floor of Hang Far Low, but also goes into things like Young China. And we talked about Chinese digests and Tsinghua Li. In case of Young China, this is in fact the English newspaper, English language newspaper. But Cathcart would have seen the daily political on the wall. This is an age where we didn't have graffiti. This was graffiti. There would have been a broadside or a poster that would have been stuck up with wheat paste. And these were the dissent, these were the dialogue, these were the anxieties of the time, and definitely not wasted on him in regards to their existence. Understanding them fully, I don't know, but he understood it enough to realize that there's a lot of symbolism within the culture and something that maybe if you don't know, maybe you don't ask, maybe you do. In the case of many things that he's included, things like jade, which have so many meanings. Here he's got it carved as a heart. The symbolism of that is you could write a soliloquy on just that alone. The ideas of double happiness and symbolisms used within Chinese culture historically are fascinating, as well as things like the inclusion of things like vases, and the fact that the right vase at the right time with the right flowers means a lot. It means a lot when you put the wrong vase with the wrong flowers at the wrong place, right? So this is something that he has learned superficially, and it's something that is desired to be conveyed to the outsider. It also is this conversation about ethics, and this one we think he also attained from Sidham's illustrations in Dobie's book on Chinatown from 1935. The Old Podai is a story of essentially a curse or a flaw in the process where a tenant has been wronged by the landlord, and the space has been emptied, and the space will not be rented by anyone else until that wrong has been rectified. And it sounds pretty grandiose, but Dobie wrote about it in 1935, and by the time Cathcart came, that space was still derelict and still for rent, as pointed out and described in the book. And it remained so for another 15 years after this image. And ultimately it is a situation where the community had a feeling that this was not going to be profitable for the landlord as long as they continued to do the wrong thing. And so that building remained unleased for several decades. And a very strong statement and a very strong internal regulation, and a very strong sense of ethics that the outsider might not have necessarily understood. He also has a lot of simple things like the Peace Society, an organization created to combat the Tong Wars of the previous period up to the 1930s. But he also has like the old bulletin board. And with that, he's photographed the old bulletin board, and it's still there. And there still are things being put up. Of course, it's also in a postcard. And that postcard is following Gente's 1908 archetype of the whole experience of the reading of Tong proclamations. And these, of course, are family business. These also are price on your head. These are everything from normal stuff to nefarious stuff. And it's things that people want to have out on the public awareness. And ultimately, this is the format in which it was presented. It was a novelty outside of Chinatown, but documented historically and something that was still viable for his generation. But it came to the heart in regards to what the tongs were and their existence, the both positive as well as negative aspects, the needs, the causes, the effects, and traditional representations. So we see him going around and documenting the family buildings, documenting the tong buildings, documenting events. This one is in fact a Freemason convention sign in front of the Bing Kong Tong. And this would probably be number 36, I believe. He also goes down the road of historic individuals within Chinatown, and Little Pete and Lo Fan, a story of the control of vice and the world in which it was created. It's a story that's still celebrated today. Lo Fan, I believe, Foreign Devil, who essentially was a white man who was hired as his bodyguard, and that Little Pete believed that no one would dare murder a white man in Chinatown. It would be a death sentence, and so he was safe as long as this man would protect him. And he did, and kind of enjoyed his role. Little Pete eventually was killed in the barber shop underneath where he lived. But little icons like this, we saw the Cathcart, anything that's half covered was about the underworld. And so here we see the Hatchet Wars of the 1880s. And this is something that's in the newspapers. This is something that's looked at with incredible curiosity in the 1880s and 1890s in the Western newspapers. And by the 1930s is looked at as history. But we've still had the Tong Wars of the 1930s in both New York, Chicago, and San Francisco that really had just ended about 5 years before he arrived. He's also acknowledging the underground and the underground city that was San Francisco. San Francisco's Chinatown as a discriminated and regulated group, it was safer to stay underground and stay off the streets. Also, whether you were doing something good or something bad, it was easier and more convenient and safer to have multiple exits. And so this icon is from down on the block under St. Mary's. Many of these well-known underground passages were in the opium resorts of the alleys like Spofford and more in the northwestern part of Chinatown. But much of that was destroyed in 1906, but much of it was not. And anybody who has a storefront on Grant Avenue has a sidewalk which can connect with their neighbor pretty easily, and in many cases still do, because the sidewalks are hollow along Grant Avenue, even under our old storefront. So his acknowledgement of the underground and its existence and the pathways on this map is very subtle, but very much part of the conversation, as well as the opium business and the drug addiction, the opium trade, and the opium dens that are going to be within those underground stations. Cathcart definitely didn't shy away from all of the aspects of the community. He recognized that Commercial Street, a street that ran right up from downtown, right into the heart of Chinatown, was until 1917 the major destination for prostitution. Places like the Mansion House were well known, written about, famous, and protected by the police within the confines of Chinatown. Here we have Madame Lazarine's business card from the very establishment from sometime probably in the 19-teens. But he also celebrates others along Commercial Street, like the Emperor Joshua Norton, a San Franciscan rice trader who lost his mind and declared himself the Emperor of the United States and Protectorate of Mexico. And he was sustained, and where he lived was a point of contesting. And Cathcart established that he lived at 624 Commercial. And here we see Emperor Norton holding his house, but he in fact is holding the house sitting at 624 Commercial. We really have Cathcart documenting life in Chinatown with a soft lens, with an eye towards education, and with an eye of celebrating and exposing how simply a few hours can change the appearance of something like Grant Avenue, from something being absolutely chaotic to something being chaotic and bright and colorful. The difference between night and day on this is what I wanted to end on, because this was the joy of going through Cathcart's photographs as reference to all of the detail. And I found it interesting. This is a shot of Hang Far Low, and it's central to his theme. And when we look and see all of these other venues down here, the importance to him for them is unknown to me, but obviously I'm going to say he was probably a benefactor, and perhaps there is a familial relationship. With that, we sum up a cultural celebration. Cathcart's map was one to encompass the community in which he was fortunate enough to live among and to document, and ultimately to try to share and tell the stories as desired by the community to promote themselves and the growth of their community outside of the boundaries as had been historically retained. That's the story of the book. Here's some places where it's available. I hope that was enjoyable for you all. It's fun for me to walk through this and kind of discuss it. I chose some new images this time so that there'll be some other visual impulses. The book is doing fairly well. I'm very excited and very happy with it. The Amazon picked up 1,000 or more, and so that always helps. And the sales in general are always good after a talk like this. So you can get a signed edition from our website, and you can get one mailed to you from any of the bookstores you see listed above, as well as Amazon. And thank you for attending, and thank you for the CHSA for having me again to discuss what is really a super fun map about a super fun community in a small town within San Francisco. I always forget things, so I'll hope that some of you will remind me of some of the things I might have forgotten that I said before and didn't this time. But I certainly enjoyed it greatly, and I hope you did as well.
Hello?
Hi, Kimberly.
Hello, thank you so much. So we're going to be going into our Q&A session now. So I had a question. I'm not sure if you can answer this or not, but since I'm a big photography person, I love taking pictures. I was wondering what kind of camera or cameras that Cathcart possibly used.
You know, I think that one Leica, he got a Leica on his 35th birthday. I think it was a gift from his father. And if you take care of that camera, it'll last you the rest of your life. And I think everything that I had, it was either a 40 millimeter commercial negative, which is a single shot, and he had a slide insert for a mic for a Leica camera so they could do single shots, or hand cut 35 millimeter rolls that could be anywhere from 20 shots to 45 shots. And those were in the original aluminum film vials that he had put them in, and they had his handwriting on the top. So one of the things about being a photographer is that he was fairly fastidious. And when something was done, he put it back in its vial and he put it back in its box, and there it sat, probably for 75 years.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's so cool.
Yeah, it was very cool. And it's great to have been privileged for me to get that from Laura
Mhm.
Dorenzo, to have that handed off. It was a year later, and it actually answered all the questions I'd had about all the maps and all the things I didn't understand what it was, but I knew it was this guy Cathcart's. And photographs answered everything. They're online too, by the way, that people can look at and review, and they support the book, but they also support just growing up in Chinatown and what's then and now and things like that. So that's pretty fun.
Yeah, that's really cool, especially how I guess detailed how he kept everything together and like super like detailed and organized. That's crazy to
Yeah.
think about. So we have some more questions for you.
Excellent.
So I guess what we wanted to ask was, what was your favorite part of like researching this project, and possibly what are your like maybe favorite map icons and photos from this particular project?
Yeah, some of the best stuff was reaching out to some of the available resources. Chinese Historical Society had Sue Lee as their director a number of years ago, and Francis Kaplan at the California Historical Society, and a librarian at the Sacramento State Library. They all made my day. These women knew their business. They were trained professionals in library sciences, and they navigated their inventory to answer questions that I had about things that were so vague and cryptic. And we're just like, we had hit dead ends, and finally said, let's find the resource. Let's find the academic source on that. Let's find and that's who these people were for us. And so we got a lot of great answers, and that was really fun because those interactions actually encouraged me to continue the process. At certain times, this 177 icons was a little daunting. There's a fair amount of stuff. My favorites were figuring out what the heck he was trying to convey, figuring out what certain things meant. There were icons, I didn't go through some of the mysteries. There were things where there's a building and it would just have G and E next to it. It would say GE underneath it. It's like, what the heck is that? It was on Montgomery Street. And it turns out it was where the golden era was, which was Bret Hart's newspaper where Mark Twain worked. And so it was about the pioneers and pioneer language and literary people. Cathcart aspired to be an author, and his books wouldn't get published, so he published maps, because what he did as an author was make notes, and his notes often included drawings. And those drawings were his way of remembering certain things, and they kind of evolved into these maps. So for me, the joy of discovering the first book printed in California. So if you have the book or if you have the map, there's an icon that says first book printed in California, and it's wrong. What Cathcart says is actually wrong. And that was super fun. What he says is it was Life in California, which was actually printed in New York. And it wasn't printed in California. It's that simple. It just was printed in Brooklyn. That's all you can say about it. First book printed in California would have been published in Monterey in Spanish in 1835. First book printed in English in California would have been exactly the book he was talking about, where he puts an X at number 8 Clay Street. And it was published by Washington Bartlett, the former alcalde of San Francisco, and a guy who had a publishing house. And it was a book called California Life as It Is and As It Should Be. But he got it messed up. He got it wrong. That was one of like 3 things that he really got wrong. I was like, cool, he got it wrong. I make mistakes all the time. Like all the time. And I think like life is, sometimes you got to be able to make mistakes. Otherwise you don't, get anywhere. And so he was kind of proud of being, he was probably one of these guys who might've been hard to be in the same room with because he was so sure he was right. But in fact, ultimately he was wrong about 2 or 3 things, and that was one of them. And finding those mistakes was really kind of a research joy. I had a staff member at the time who was a great researcher, and she helped write the initial manuscript, and her creativity in regards to researching and finding places to look. Being 15 years younger than me, she definitely looked down a certain digital archive that I might not have thought of. And that was helpful to find a partial answer to a question. One answer leads to another little partial answer and a partial answer, and eventually you kind of get a picture. It's amazing. Some things came like that, and other things it took like months to figure out what the hell they were talking about. And there are still 7 icons on the map. We don't know what they mean at all.
Wow. Well, and I guess this kind of leads into my next question of like, how are you planning, or like, what are you going to do about continuing research with this particular project? I guess like looking into those icons is one of them.
Yeah. Well, one of if the book goes to a second printing, then it would be the opportunity to do a quick editing and be able to insert an appendage, a couple of pages that will, because things come in. Every day I get emails, I get photographs, I get family histories, and these things really build the conversation. Of course, anything I have, I'm just going to put on the website or give to CHSA, make them deal with it. It's true though, because ultimately all this a lot of it is about creating a public domain of information that can be accessed and easily supported that way. For the most part, I'm going to move on also to the next book, which is about that California map. It has got a good deal of information about the Chinese American diaspora coming into California, but it also is about the greater story of California's Rancho history as well as gold history, and that will of course be very distracting. My hope for updates is that we're able to include the so far dozen and 15, maybe 15 answers, I guess, that we've gotten. We've still got another 15 to find, and it's hard because you often find something out the day after you go to print, kind of thing, and at a certain point you gotta make your own pencil notes.
Thank you, Jim. Actually, speaking about your second book, we had a question from Doreen, if you know about when will the book be published, if you know.
No, we're shooting for 2022. The publication is still literally being written as we speak. and the research is going on now. So when we talk about research, yeah, I'm in the middle of that right now on some things that are also unfamiliar, and that's going to take the year, I imagine. And
Yeah.
I do have the advantage that this book, we established a good formula of interpreting Cathcart's maps, and his maps have a certain linear aspect to them, thinking wise, that allows us to decipher them in a very linear fashion, and it makes it approachable. It also makes it so you can jump around. You can go, well, what's this icon mean? You don't have to read the book. You can go, oh, well, what's that in B6? I want to figure that out. And sometimes chapter reading is more important. So anyway, we'll see. 2022 is the date, though. March is
Okay.
when they release books. So
Awesome. We
oops, she's out in Idaho with snow. So we'll see if we get her back. May have lost her.
Oh no. Well,
Do you have any other
okay.
questions?
Yes. So I guess one question, another question is, what's like the one thing that you'd like the audience to take away from this book?
Oh, fun. I think it's a celebratory map. It's a celebratory book. I think it's something that I hope it provokes your curiosity. The thing about the book is that it's an attempt to scratch the surface on stories that have a lot of depth, and not every story will appeal to everybody, but some stories will really appeal to some people and they'll really strike a nerve. And I've found that very rewarding. I've had that shared with me, but I've also experienced that myself. And I think it's a lot to ask, but I think if you engage with the book and you grew up in San Francisco, and not just Chinatown, but specifically, I think you'll take away something about the solidarity of the community, small town that we know as Chinatown within the tiny city of San Francisco. It puts into perspective the scale in which life was just a generation or two ago. And I think you can really feel that. So that's my takeaway from it myself.
All right. And then the next question is a more general overview. What particularly got you interested in maps and down this particular career path that you're on right now?
Yeah, that's funny. I've been doing maps like my whole life. I was a logisticist. I was in operations. I moved stuff. I used maps. I enjoyed maps a lot, traveled the world using maps, but I collected maps the whole time I did that. And it's something when I was just a kid, old paper, like I understood old brass, I understood old ivory. And these are things that don't decompose. These are things that, you drop it, it doesn't break. You set a match to it, it doesn't burn. But paper, and I discovered when I was about 12, that paper, good paper, would last hundreds of years. In fact, better than modern paper. I'm like, what? And that set me down this path of curiosity about old paper. And with that then came maps and all of that goes with it. Maps are a pathway to study of colonialism, study of man's history, perspective, geopolitics, geophysicals. I mean, maps are, because I own a map store, maps are essentially an articulation of who we are, and whether you map or not, you map. Every person maps how they see the world. They're mapping, they map on their phone. No matter what you're doing, you're actually using mapping. And understanding that as part of who we are, kind of like, oh, wow, that's pretty interesting. So I can go down that rabbit warren all day long. And that started when I was young, and it still does. I'm here in a marvelous, you can't see, but in front of me are flat files filled with about 7,000 or 8,000 maps. And yeah, I'm in heaven. It's great. And this map as an example was a great map. I've seen thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of maps, great maps from all over the world. And this map was like, wow, this is a great map. This is among one of the better maps I've ever seen. Why do I not know it? Who is this guy? What is it about? So that's really one of the joys, as well, as that the map itself is about a great community and a great culture, but it's also a great map unto itself. If you're going to have a representation, this is a good one to have,
Yeah, that's really cool. It's definitely a way of expressing oneself that I've actually never really thought about, because maps to me are just kind of for me to get from point A to point B for the
Right.
most part, especially in like the modern era.
Yeah, I think for Cathcart, maps were a way of him articulating stories that he couldn't get out verbally, and that whatever he wrote, it wasn't good enough to have been published. All of the cafes and lunch joints that we show in the beginning around the Montgomery block, the Philosopher's Inn and things like that, these are places where Jack London hung out, places where Dobie hung out, places where, in fact, his mentors that he's paying homage to on the map, like Herbert Asbury, had lunch as well. And so you can see he's kind of, his aspirations to be a literary person are fairly strong, but for whatever reason, his writings weren't of the want at the time. And so he made maps, and his maps were very good. They were successful in their endeavors. They were successful. I don't know if he made any money. I didn't
Yeah.
mention that when he lived in the Montgomery block, his rent was $14 a month, and he paid that $14 a month every month for 20 years. So that was his rent his whole life there.
Wow.
That's a lot of money.
And so we have a question from David, and he's asking, do you know anything about the hand-drawn lynch maps that were drawn in 1895?
I don't know anything about them. There's one at Bancroft, so they have one. There's some digital representations of them, I think, but no, I don't know much about it. It's an interesting question. I like being stumped. It's cool. I'll have to look it up. And if you want to reach out to me and give me more information, I'd love to hear it.
Yes,
Totally.
yep, we'll be reaching out over to him as well. And the next question is from Jenye, I believe, and she asks, she, I believe, or he, are there indexes of place names and people's names in the appendix of the book?
Oh, yeah, no, so identifying who and where, no. It would have been nice. For the most part, in many cases, the individuals are, who they are is only coming to light now as their descendants and relatives come out and say, oh, that's my auntie. Or in fact, there's this last month, there are probably 4 people I've identified in the book. But at the time, and the only reason is because of relatives coming out and saying, I know that person, which was my hope. But in fact, locations, one of the beauties of Cathcart was his documentation was so good that in many cases, the location can be ascertained right now because the place looks very much similar. Chinatown's fairly special in that it aesthetically still has the same basis. All of those neon signs we saw are still up on the walls. They've just been painted over and the glass is gone now, but they're still there. So yeah, and that's actually something, some of the photos I do identify their location in their title and their keywords. I put the collection up. It was a lot of work getting all the photos up, and I put the collection up and got it up there. And then I waited and said, well, I'm not going to promote it until I have something to promote it. And it's been sitting kind of waiting for people to look at it for the last 5 years. And now with the book, people are. So I'm hoping to get some feedback on people looking at the photo site and giving me input, because I will include that in keywords. Part of the fun of the photo site is that it's a free site to go and look at old Chinatown. Most of the locations, if I know it, I have included it only because I love that stuff. But Cathcart made a point of documenting it in a way that there'd be a street sign and a car with a license plate with a date on it and a business behind it with a phone number. And you pretty much could tell what day of the month and year you were there. You know, he was amazing in his documentation. So that was what was the most fun for me, is figuring out the photographs and where and when. So I probably shared it some, but not as much. And in the book, probably not as much.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It's also crazy how meticulous again he was. That's because most photographers I put like that's not possible. Like it'll be a picture, it'll be a building. That building was probably there hundreds of years ago, and then you don't even know where it is. And our next question is from Vicky, and she asks, are there any references to Donaldina Cameron and the Occidental mission home on the map?
Yes, I'm sorry. And because I created a new presentation this time, Donaldine Cameron and Cameron House were removed from this talk, but in fact, they are central as one of the important figures within the map. They have a big icon with her with it. There is representation. The book discusses it a bit with some good old photographs. For me, it was a great privilege in that the Presbyterian Ladies Fellowship had me speak for them a month or so ago. And it wasn't until 3/4 of the way through that I realized they are the modern representation of the Donald D. Cameron mission. And so I did have enough inclusion in it to show, but the fact is there is a nice bit, and Cathcart's photos aren't as comprehensive as the inclusion is on the map. That is to say, there are only about 3 or 4 photos of the mission itself, whereas so many other sites, there are so many photos of them. But yes, it's right in the heart of it. And anyone my age, I mean, it's an important part of the Chinatown community. And I think he recognized that very much so. It's the first Presbyterian mission in the US, Western US. It's 1853, I believe. So first Presbyterians, and there, of course, was in Chinatown.
That's another cool fun fact to learn. Our next question is from Amanda, and she asks, do any of Ken Cathcart's writings survive, maybe such as in things like unpublished letters or papers?
Yeah, there's it's really rote. It's not rote, but really dry, mundane kind of stuff. But it's interesting. Some of the photographic record was predominantly negatives, but with it were some of his published photos, or some of those photos which he had produced as prints in his time. So there were, 40, 70-year-old photographs, and with them were some that we could see he had used as part of his promotions. And they came with little 3x5 cards with them that were typed out with hand note variations. So I didn't get an insight into his handwriting very much because they were typed, but we got an insight into how he worked and what he was creating, and they were very interesting. A couple of those were included in the book. So there's a discussion of one of the restaurants on Jackson Street, and the employees getting together and giving to $300 or $400 to the war relief effort, and that was typed out. And the way he did it, he was very pedantic. He was very meticulous. He was, and the 3x5 cards on a typewriter with the photograph was really kind of telling. But interestingly, knowing that he was a failed author, not included with the stuff was any literary writings or any accomplishments in that regard, and whether he divested of them or if more likely Laura Dorenzo didn't see those. She was a visual person. She saw things as maps and the photos and things. These were visual arts that she understood. And so I think that she might not have, if there were writings, she might not have saved them, and they wound up in landfill, right?
Or you may never know, it might still be passed down in the family,
True.
possibly.
And he didn't have any family. He passed away. He was likely a gay man who moved here to reinvent himself and get away from the bigotry of the South and essentially live a reinvented life. His name was Orrin Gwynn Cathcart, and he changed it to Ken when he arrived at 35 years old. And he lived a very modest and quiet life. But I believe Laura said his partner had predeceased him by 5 years, and he had no relatives or known kin, or at least those who wanted to have anything to do with him. He was an only child. He did have a cousin who lived in Harper, Kansas, and I only know that because the photographic record is so good. We could figure that stuff out and then go to Ancestry.com and literally put a name to the photograph. So those kind of things are pretty cool too.
Yeah, that's always interesting to think about. Yeah. Well, thank you so much today for speaking with us, Jim.
A great pleasure. I hope it was a time well spent, and thank you for the questions. Those are the things I love the most. And if you do have any more, please reach out to me. And thank you for the time.
Yes, yeah, we're very happy to learn more about San Francisco Chinatown through these maps. Most definitely, I've learned a lot. I've learned like so much, like things that I've never probably even thought about. And it's always cool to see people's various perspectives and takes on like a particular place. And and once again, everyone, you guys can go ahead and check out Jim's store. I've linked it down in the chat, and he is all online now. You can go ahead and support him there. And I wish that you all have happy holidays and a great new year. I hope that you all stay happy, healthy, safe, and definitely be on the lookout for programs coming in 2021 with CHSA, and we'll see you next year.
Yay.
Thank you for coming,
Thank you.
I
everyone.
wanted to say thank you, Kimberly. This was the first program that she ran today for CHSA, and she did a great job. I think she's going to be a
excellent.
permanent fixture, maybe, hopefully. But thank you,
Good job.
Kimberly. Thank you,
Kimberly.
everyone, for joining. Have a good night.
Thank you.